Right.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. I'm really delighted to have Corporal Mark Splash Aston, the author of the book SAS Seeking Down. Now, it's a hell of a good listen or a good read. I recommend it to all of you out there. And it's particularly the sort of gritty real life stories. Many generals write lots of books about the SAS and things like that. But when you've got a soldier who writes their story in a way that has humility and you can relate to it, and certainly I was in the army at the time of the Falklands War, which is particularly the focus of this book, even though his career spanned a larger one. It's well worth a read. And there's lots of lessons for us, whether you've been in the military or not, certainly for lessons for leaders in business who listen to this as much as those in the military. Without further ado, welcome, Mark. Good to have you on the show.
Thank you very much.
So tell us, why did you decide to write the book? And because, I mean, the Falklands War was back in 81, 82, wasn't it? 82.
Yeah, 82. Yeah.
That's like 21 years ago, but everybody's really enjoyed the book. What do you think has been the appeal? Has people told you what they liked about it?
Because it's down to earth. I haven't my desire of it was to produce the book that wasn't a big I am.
Yeah.
You know, there's several of these books have come out now that have really done the regiment a disservice. And I wanted this to be a proper, down-to-earth, this is what it was really like type book.
Yeah.
And that was the reason.
Yeah, and it is so interesting. I'm discussing with a couple of Navy SEALs some of their stories. And before you, I've had a number of SAS soldiers and officers on the program. And I think it's really important that people keep their ego in check. And one of the things that was lovely about our mutual friend who introduced us was that he said, look, Mark has a lovely humility and a humanity about him. The stories are really real and we can relate to them. So that's what I enjoyed. And I've listened to it and really enjoyed it. Couldn't stop listening to it. It was a really good read. We mention often people who've inspired us. And when you and I talked about it, you talked about Company Sergeant Major Lawrence Gallagher of D Sqn 22 SAS, who sadly was killed while out there in the Falklands. And also you talked about Cedric Dells, the squadron commander who went on to be Lieutenant General Sir Cedric Dells. Do you want to just tell us a bit about why you chose those two and what qualities they had that you think, in your mind, make them inspiring leaders with lessons for us today?
Well, Lawrence was like a gentle giant. He was about 6'6", 6'7" tall, big man. He didn't have to back up anything he said, if you know what I mean. You immediately did as you were told. But he was a very kind man, full of advice, always there if you needed help in any way whatsoever. But at the same time, he was a powerful person, and I thought that he was something that I really who I should look up to and try to aspire to be similar to. Cedric Dells was the company commander or the squadron commander when we went to the Falklands. He could have sat back and sent the patrols out and sat back in the ops room and just monitored everything, but he didn't. We had a very dodgy task given to us where we had to go forward onto Mount Kent, which is 60 miles in front of everyone else's lines. There had been no support for us to hold the ground until 3 Para and 4-2 Commando could get to us. So rather than send just one of the patrols out to do a recce, he went himself. And to me, that was leadership. And another person I really aspire to look up to. Yeah,
no, it's a great story. And in fact, even just speaking to CEOs in business today, one of the key messages is don't expect others to do a job you wouldn't do yourself. But that doesn't mean you have to get down into the weeds of doing everybody else's job for them and micromanaging them. You do need to step back. You needed Cedric to make some of the strategic decisions about, the attack on Pebble Island, on taking out the Picaras and things like that, and thinking where next and where to put the OPs and stuff like that. So I think from what you've said and from your book, what struck me was that you joined 22 SAS having been a staff sergeant, a senior non-commissioned officer in your own regiment, which I think was the Gloucesters. Was that right? Your regiment?
That's right, yeah. In the Gloucesters, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to get to that rank in your own regiment and then go back, initially you become a trooper, but you were a corporal. You take a real hit, but yet your credibility with everybody else you meet is so much bigger. And also the strategic impact of the work you do way bigger, and also the kind of people who you talk to and give advice to. And even throughout your career, as I was reading about the other jobs that you've had, and you were telling me about that, you get given a degree of respect that was way in excess of what you'd get in a normal infantry battalion. Is that fair, my understanding?
That's true. We always said, all my friends have said exactly the same thing, is that the color of the berry immediately makes you worth listening to.
Yeah.
So you could, if we said something, people listen.
Yeah.
Whereas before, where you're wearing a crap hat, then you you get said, "Oh yeah, thank you very much, color," and that's about it.
Yeah, and the expression "a crap hat" for those listening who've never been in our army jargon. You had those who were in the parachute regiment who were very proud of having their maroon beret, the sand-colored berry of the SAS, but a crap hat was any other hat that wasn't in there. There's almost like pecking order between different tribes. But yeah, you went into a very different, difficult selection process. And many years ago, no one talked about the SEALs, no one talked about the SAS or the SBS. But then came the time when the dam broke. And I think it was de la Billière who wrote his book, which actually must have upset a lot of people because you just didn't write about it. You didn't talk about the operations because, of course, that could compromise them for terrorists and other people listening to them. What went on at the time when suddenly there was then a flood of books? What was your view of what had happened?
Well, at the time, I was in agreement with everyone else that people shouldn't be writing books. And this is a bit two-faced of me, really, but we shouldn't be writing books. Humility comes into it, modesty or whatever, and a lot of the books that are being written, Bravo 20, excellent read, but absolute fiction. Yeah, and it did not do the regiment any favors at all doing that. And that was another one of the reasons I wanted my book not to be in that genre. I wanted it to be proper, straightforward, and the truth. Yeah,
and that's what comes across. And I think there's a danger that people make SEALs or SAS or SBS soldiers and officers into some kind of Superman that nothing goes wrong, no problems happen. But in SAS Seeking Down, in your book, there's all sorts of situations that go terribly badly wrong, and we'll talk about them in a moment or two. But I'm just interested in Mark, what shaped you. I mean, now you're 75. You've had a hell of a life, even in an element of that. But you've packed in an awful lot, and now, am I right? You're doing endurance, long distance running. What are you doing now?
Ultra running, yeah.
Ultra running. And how far is an ultra race?
Well, I only do the short ones. Only do the 50Ks.
Only do the 50 kilometers. I love that one.
I'm lucky. My wife does them as well, so we do it as a pair. So I've got company. And we work well together. If I'm having a hard time, she'll turn around and tell me, "Don't be a tart, get on with it."
She sounds like just the lady you need, and I think anybody else wouldn't be good enough. I'm very lucky to have a wife like that. I mean, I think I'm on my second wife, and it tends to be my last wife. I think you're on your third wife. Am I right?
That's right. Yeah. Enough said.
Enough said. But actually, it raises an interesting point that military service does have a very tough impact. I was, 20 years in the military, and particularly people in special forces. Their marriages very often crumble and fall apart under the pressure of always being away, never knowing where you're going, and you can't tell them where you're going. So there are, of course, some of the philanderers who make up that they're in the SAS or they're in MI6 and they keep disappearing for their other relationship. That's an aside sort of fantasies. But in the military, and particularly when you're on a lot of tours and a lot of duties, as you did, it does put a real strain on. Did you see that not just for yourself, but for others, that the strain breaks up many marriages or distances parents from children?
Very much so. Very much so. I think I only know a few people who kept the same wife. Certainly from when they joined the regiment, those wives that came from outside with them never lasted.
Yeah,
it was suddenly just too much for a lot of them,
Yeah. Well, I mean, even in a different way, for those listening, you won't see, but I've got some pictures on the back wall, which is one of my father, a fast jet pilot with the Fleet Air Arm, and their wedding. In their day, they'd go away for 6 months to a year in the Far East, as it was called, and there was no way of communicating. My mother would occasionally, as the commanding officer's wife, try and slip in to a telex that they were sending to the ship that, Sailor Johnson's wife has just had a baby boy, or there's a real problem with so-and-so. Could he come back? And, the answer was no, they can't come back. They just got to crack on. And so people had whole lives that they lived separate from each other. And then when they came back, the ones who tried to take over again and be the man in charge, that never kind of worked well. That the wife had to sort of carry on running the show, because suddenly, like you were, at short notice, you just come back, you're off again. And it required a real quality person to be able to cope with that, don't you think?
Oh, very much so. I remarried in it was December 81, late December 81. And in the new year, we went to Kenya for a couple of months, and then came back from that. We had a week back in UK, and then we went to the Alps doing mountaineering and stuff like that. And we came back and we were given 2 weeks leave, and then within 3 days of that 2 weeks leave, we were off to the Falklands. It was as quick as that.
Yeah. No, just deep respect for you and the guys who went through that and their families, because it is a system. It's a family system, and it has an impact on the children too, who perhaps don't see the father that they knew, or in the case of, John Hamilton or Lawrence, the father didn't live. And in the case of my father, I was 2.5 when he was killed flying, saving the life of 2 other people, but he died in the process. And I still miss him, and I'm in my 60s, and you really never quite come to terms with it. So it isn't just the individual who goes off to fight, but it's the whole family that are left hanging. So deep respect for you and all that you've been through, Mark. Let's the kind of man you are today, and the kind of man that went to the Falklands, there was an upbringing that comes with that, and I'm always interested in the kind of upbringing, because going to go and do selection for the SAS, it's really tough. And I've done sort of elements of it in preparation for doing it, but then I was in a car crash and ended up in hospital, and I just realized perhaps I might never get in, or my back might not hang up to it because it was whiplash and the collapsed lung and things like that. So I always aspired to get in, but never went for selection. But you did, and you got in first time, and a number of people I know had to go back a second time. What was the selection like in the days when you did it, and what did you find hard, and what kind of mental attitude allowed you to get through it when it was so grueling?
Well, the whole thing about selection is that no one ever turns around and says you're not good enough, or you tells you to stop doing it. If you know what I mean. You start on week 1 and you're into it, and you keep doing it, and the only thing that pushes you through is you. If anybody that leaves are leaving because they want to leave, or they've been injured enough to leave. The SAS directing staff don't tell you to hurry up. They don't give you any encouragement whatsoever. You just get pointed A to B, you do it, and it gets harder. Each day gets harder as you go along. And then the final week, after a month, you're traipsing about the beacons. The last week, you start off with a rifle and 35-pound on your back, and the distances go up every day. And then the weight goes up every day until at the end of that test week, you've got half a hundredweight on your back and a rifle, and you've got to do 40 miles in my case, it was 19 hours. But they don't tell you that it's 19 hours. You just have to go balls out, best you can, and do it as fast as you can and arrive at the end. And then I knew guys that went through the whole 6-month selection process and were told, sorry, we don't want you. So you don't know. You're just always, the whole time, there's like the sword of Damocles hanging over your head. You just wonder whether you're going to be told to go. And that's what it's like.
And that must be so hard unless you have quite a drive and a motivation in you to not be outer focused of what others think of you, but you've got this inner drive. Now, you went and did it. I think, were you a sergeant or a staff sergeant when you did selection? Because was that
staff sergeant?
Yeah,
staff sergeant.
I mean, I don't know whether that was a help to you, but certainly you'd by that stage accumulated a lot of infantry experience. And when I heard your book and what you had to do and the amount of kit you were carrying at times, staggering along with all the green nasties of mortar rounds around you and the extra weight and radios and radio batteries, it made all the selection training that you're doing essential, because you had to actually do the thing you trained for. Wasn't that the case? That's
true. I mean, the selection was hard, but I did so many things that were much harder after I got into the regiment. You know, it's a good preparation. The great thing about selection is that everyone that passes it, you know, are at a certain standard and you know what they can do. In a normal infantry regiment, the only thing you know about the person, he got through basic training. You don't know whether you can trust him. You don't know whether he can navigate or anything like that. But in the regiment, you know exactly what beast you've got with you.
That's so interesting, because you and I were talking beforehand about I had 2 years as a platoon commander with the 2nd Battalion Scots Guards, just in the year after they'd come back from the Falklands. They were recovering in Cyprus, and it was a real honor to command a guards platoon. But when talking to the lance sergeants and the corporals there and the guardsmen, they said what was very interesting, unlike what you were describing, because there wasn't a selection to get in the same way, and the word is just used, selection, and everybody knows selection means going for the SAS, that they didn't know who was going to be good and who wasn't. You know, what someone's like marching up and down the mall in a bearskin and a tunic and looking very strong and fine, that person completely crumbled when in the wet bog, and you know, the ship had just been bombed, the Welsh Guards, and they were trying to get up to Tumbledown, and they didn't cope at all well. Whereas the complete rogue, who was often in jail and had been a meth drinker in Glasgow before he joined, he was the one lining up the 66s, firing up the rocks at the Argentinian 5th Battalion, and telling the platoon commander to get on and get going. And so it was almost like topsy-turvy world. You didn't know what people were going to be like. Any thoughts on that, Mark?
Oh, I agree entirely. I think I was lucky that I actually went to a real war with the SAS, because we knew exactly what we've got, you know, and the guys are tough. They do, and you know that he's got your back.
Yeah.
You know, you trust him implicitly. Yeah, that's the difference.
Yeah, and we were talking about upbringing. I mean, what kind of upbringing? Who were the role models for you that gave you this kind of mental resilience and physical resilience, which lasts you throughout your time in the Gloucesters and in the SAS?
Well, when I first joined the battalion as a very young 17-year-old, I was put into a rifle platoon, and the platoon sergeant was a guy called Roy Watkins. Now, Roy had done his national service, had gone out, come back in, and he was like 15 years older than me as a platoon sergeant, and he was the epitome of what a rifle platoon sergeant should be. He was upright, a good man. You didn't screw him around, and because he wasn't above giving you a cuff around the head, but he was a good guy, and he'd looked after us. We were his boys, and he made sure that we weren't screwed over at all. But I really liked him, and he was another one that I tried to emulate throughout my service. A good man.
Yeah, it is nice when you meet special people, and I just want to think about good men that you and I have met over the time. Just call out Jose Sanchez, who introduced us both. And how did you get to meet Jose? Because he was in the parachute regiment, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was with. I met him when he was with the 4 Para, which is the territorial or reserves regiment. And in reality, I only met him when I went up to Leicester to 4 Para to do a talk for them up at their HQ up there.
Yeah. Well, lovely guy, and he did the battlefield bike ride, raising money for Help for Heroes, the 500 kilometers that we did. And he said to me, "The man you need is Mark." I really loved his talk, and has written this great book and that kind of stuff. So I just want to call out Jose. What a great guy with a lovely balanced view of life. I think had he had his world differently, I think he would have been a good man to have in a trench with. So fascinating experience. You ended your time as a regimental sergeant major, involved in infantry trials and things like that. Fascinating roles that you had over the years. But let's spend a bit of time on the time of the Falklands War, because I can't imagine what it was like as you were going up to the glacier on South Georgia. Is it the Fortuna Glacier? Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
And then not only one helicopter crash, but 2 helicopter crashes in complete whiteout, almost impossible conditions and storm. And you had to survive on the glacier for a bit. Do you want to just tell us a bit about that, Mark?
Well, basically what had happened was we were tasked to go up onto the Fortuna Glacier, which is about 5 miles from the whaling station they wanted us to observe. And it took 3 attempts to get up onto the glacier to start with, because the high winds, blizzard conditions, and the rest of it. But the pilots got us up there, dropped us off, and the pilots then went. We roped up and started moving up the glacier, and we could only go about a mile because the conditions were so horrendous. The winds were hurricane winds, so we decided to stay to leaguer up for the night and see what it was like the next day. Well, in any case, the next morning, it was absolute pandemonium. There was tents had been blown away, and I think there was one tent that was up, and there was 6 guys sat in it. That's what was holding it up. There's blokes underneath sleds and stuff like that. And we got a met check from squadron headquarters, and they said, yeah, the weather's going to change, but it's not going to get better. So it's going to get worse. So we said, well, we're in shit state here. We're going to start losing people if we don't withdraw. So they said, okay, we'll get some aircraft up to you. Well, the aircraft turned up, and three helicopters, a Mark 5 anti-submarine helicopter, and 2 Mark 3 troop-carrying helicopters. And the way they'd been flying, because it was whiteout conditions, was that the lead helicopter was the Mark 5, because he had radar and or sonar or whatever, he could see the ground. The other 2 helicopters were using him okay, as their horizon. So while
Wow.
he was up, they knew they were up. In any case, we all powered onto these helicopters and we flew off down the glacier. Now, because the glacier sort of was going down towards the sea, the lead helicopter dipped out of sight, and the second helicopter lost his horizon and flew into the ground. So he just crashed. So we landed. I was in the third helicopter. We landed, and me and a few of the other guys went across and started helping the guys out of the first helicopter. And the second helicopter, the one that had crashed. The first helicopter came back and then said, I can't take any of you. I'm that low on fuel. I'm going to have to go back. Okay. So so what happened was we then piled onto the Mark III. Okay, all of us on it. And we went in the same thing again, where the Mark V flew down the glacier. Our pilot lost his horizon when he went out of sight, and we crashed as well. So we're sort of, when I say crash, it was like a traffic accident. We weren't very far off the ground at all. And so we piled out of that. The Mark III said, I've got no fuel left. I can't take anybody. I'm going to go back down and refuel. And we thought, right, that's it. We won't see him until tomorrow, like. And so we got out the life rafts and we from the helicopter and started going into survival mode. Well, an hour and a half later, just as we got Bruce on, as it always happens with helicopters, they arrived then. The Mark III came back and he said, we got one chance of this. You're all going to have to get onto it. Now,
Wow.
Normally there's room for about 4 passengers in the back of the Mark III because of all the sonar gear that's in there, the dippers and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And so we piled on, and with the crew, we had, I think it was 17.
Instead of 3 in the back, there's 17 of you.
Yeah, we piled in. We were all stacked on top of each other, you know. And we flew back down, and I can just remember as we flew down, looking out the door, because we couldn't close the door because people's legs were out of it, and watching the rotor disc of the rotors, you know, about 2 meters away from huge rock faces and stuff like that, and we were being blown all over the place. And we flew down onto the back of Antrim. Now, what normally happens is that you come down, and the pilot mirrors the direction and speed of the ship, so he just crabs across and lands gently on the deck. Well, this wasn't going to happen. We flew down there. The deck crew were trying to wave him off, but our pilot said no, sod this, and we just flew. And basically, it was a controlled crash on the back deck of this aircraft, on the ship. And luckily, the deck crew were really switched on, and they put the strops on, and we all started piling out. Now you can imagine, it's like you see these videos of minis with about 20 people getting out, piling out this. And the strange thing was that we all get taken up to the wardroom, which was being used as a hospital on the ship at the time, and we were all treated for hypothermia and stuff like that, but nobody was badly injured at all. Just cuts and bruises and stuff like that.
That was amazing. And again, it's another reason why you do a selection process. You've got a rugged group who can cope. Now, I'm so impressed. There you are at 75, in great health, doing ultra marathon. Have you not had any major injuries or major health scares during your time? Because when you put yourself through the kind of ordeals you did, the wet conditions, the trench foot, all the rest, and we're going to talk about another helicopter crash, which the whole book is named after, in a minute. But all that you went through, have you not had major injuries, broken things or whatever?
I snapped my Achilles tendon. That's the only serious injury I've had. I snapped it doing something stupid, running out a ramp on an assault course, and being on a cold day, and we hadn't warmed up, and I just felt that my tendon went. It felt like I'd just gone over on my ankle, and but we did the flipper test, as they call it, but to see, and the PGI we had working with us at the Long Range Recce School said, I think you've snapped your tendon.
I know.
No, oh shit, so we went down to the local German hospital, and they said, "I think you snapped your tendon." And within 3 hours, I was on the slab and operated on, which was
Wow.
excellent. So I think that's why I recovered so well from it.
Yeah, because a number of people doing what you and others would be doing have a whole string of injuries, and later in life they're scrambling around. But well done you, whether it be the hard upbringing in Gloucester or whatever. But I think certain people have a more robust body to cope with what life throws at them when they do selection. Others, it was not meant to be. Do you think some are luckier than others?
I think so. What we found on selection was it was never the really big 6'7" body, sort of six packs and all that sort of stuff. They weren't the ones who got through. It was just little wiry guys like me.
Yeah, well, look, well done. Deep respect for that. So, in the Falklands War, you had some really exciting moments and lots of dull moments. But I was very taken by the account of going on to West Falklands, to Pebble Island, to take out those Picaras, which could have caused mayhem for the landing in San Carlos. Tell us a little bit about that. That was like boys' own stuff Sterling would have been proud of when you were going up and down, taking out the aircraft, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was basically what happened was one of the Harrier jets had picked up a radar hit, and they thought it would come from Pebble Island, so they flew a photo flight over it, and it picked up there were aircraft and what looked like a radar on Pebble Island. And the Navy weren't too worried about the aircraft, but they were really worried about this radar, which would give really early warning of the ships coming in to do the landings in San Carlos, because the island is sort of at the mouth of San Carlos. So the plan came up that we would go and do this raid on the island. And what we did was we put 8 guys ashore in Klepper canoes to do the recce. They went off, did the recce, and said, yes, the aircraft are there. Looks like they're real. There's 11 aircraft. And so they said, right, we're going in tonight. And it was the usual thing. All the plans you want to make go tits up the minute you start sort of following the plan. And it started off with we were supposed to have been flying in about 10 o'clock at night. So 10 o'clock comes, it's blowing an absolute hoolie outside on the deck of Hermes. And so they decide that they can't put the Sea Kings up onto the deck and open the rotors up on deck. So what they did was they actually, one by one, we had 4 aircraft, one by one they were put onto the ramp and open the rotors up on the lift.
Wow.
Lift, yeah.
Wow.
Open them up and start the engines just turning. And then they then lifted each aircraft up in turn onto the deck. That took time, obviously. So we are now an hour and a half late. We then got up and got onto the aircraft, and then they realized that they had too much fuel for the amount of weight they'd be carrying. So they had to burn off that fuel. That was another hour wasted hanging around. And eventually we got on, and we were the best part of 3 hours late starting. So the biggest enemy you always have is what's on your wrist, your watch. Time is always a problem. So we flew in, we arrived, met up with the troop commander of the recce party, and he then gave us a very quick brief. And then we set off like scalded cats trying to make up the difference, the time. And the amount of kit we were carrying, every man was carrying 2 mortar rounds for our close support weapon, and they weigh 5 kilos each, so that's 10 kilos there. Plus, I was carrying that much ammunition. I had 2 66mm Law anti-tank rockets. I carried something like about 400 rounds for my personal weapon, plus hand grenades and stuff like that, usual things. Anyway, we set off, and it was really, really quick. And it ended up with the guys at the front were going flat out, and the guys at the back were running, trying to keep up. Eventually, we got down to the rally point, and what should have happened was a very seamless drop off the mortar bombs and keep going on. But we ended up going into all-round defence at the rally point, which was going to be the mortar base plate. And what had happened was that the troop that was actually had been tasked to do the actual assault on the airstrip somehow had got lost. They hadn't turned up. And our troop, 19 troop, was supposed to have been doing close support or as a quick reaction force and staying at the rally point. And first we knew that of the new plan, as you know, ongoing thing, was that when John Hamilton came running back across to us, you know, virtually laughing with glee, saying, "Change of plan, we've got the airfield." So we now became the guys actually attacking the airstrip itself. Now, us and 16 troop should have been going into the village and dealing with the air crew and stuff like that. Time was against us again. So all that happened was the 16 troop then formed a screen between the airfield and the village, just in case there was a counterattack. And then we moved in and formed up, went on to the airstrip. And the plan was, I mean, the only plan I heard shout was, "We'll make it up by ear," by John. And we got onto the airstrip, and I just heard shout, "Nobody crosses the airstrip. Anybody working on the right stays on the right. People stay on the left." So nobody's going to get shot. And we start, and most of the aircraft were on the left, as I remember. And John, with his gang, were placing charges on each of the aircraft in the same place on each plane, so they couldn't bastardize 3 planes to make it 1 plane. So we're destroying the lot. And I was in charge of a gun team, and we were brassing up these aircraft on the other side. Ones are a bit further away with machine gun fire. I put 2 rockets through this sky van that was there, and forgetting that it's not a tank, and that the rockets just went straight through and they exploded off in the distance somewhere.
Oh no.
And we were sort of just brassing these things up with the machine guns. And eventually a fuel tank got ruptured and fuel was spilling out all over the ground, and the tracer round went into the fuel, and just this huge atomic mushroom went up of the sky van. Anyway, we were on target for about 20 minutes. Then I heard Cedric saying, withdraw now. 16 troop up on their toes and gone. We were having so much fun on the airstrip that it was a bit of a job getting everyone together. And as we sort of consolidated ourselves and were just leaving, there was these huge explosions around us. And we thought initially what was happening was that Glamorgan, HMS Glamorgan, who was doing our close naval gunfire support, was having drop shorts. And everyone who had a radio was shouting, "Check fire, check fire." But what it was that there was a little outpost of Argentinians, which were on the edge of the airstrip, who quite sensibly stayed completely below ground and didn't get out. And they had a detonator for these cratering charges that were on the airstrip. And they blew these, and that's what it was. They blew up.
Wow.
Anyway, we took a couple of casualties with guys hit by rocks and stuff like that. And we then started limping off the airstrip. And just as we're leaving the airstrip, the Argentinians decided that they were going to be brave now and try and do a counterattack, which was a mistake. Needless to say, they came second. They took a couple of casualties and then they disappeared. They didn't want to know. And then we went back post haste to back to the rally point. Aircraft came in smack on time, pile on the aircraft, flew across to the where we initially landed, picked up the canoes which were there, and then we flew back to HMS Hermes just in time for breakfast. So
Oh.
job well done.
One hell of a story. One hell of a story. And as people are listening to this and your whole experience, Mark, not just with the Falklands, but in your service, if you could come up with sort of tips for people, a couple of leadership tips that you think are relevant, both in peace as in war, anything comes to mind that, lessons learned from this? I mean, you've talked already about, no plan survives the first meeting with the enemy, and time and weather and, stuff breaking. And if it can go wrong, it will go wrong, making sure you have another plan. But any lessons from you at this stage?
Right, it's exactly as you said. No plan survives the first shot.
Mm.
Not once did we do anything on the Falklands where it went absolutely to plan. Everything we had to sort of think on your feet, but you need to have that ability to think on your feet. What's going to happen if this doesn't work? No, and that's how we do it.
Yeah.
That's all you can say is that you just got to have a nimble mind.
Yeah.
About it. Don't be what's the word I'm looking for? Don't be sort of forced into one mindset on something. You've got to be able to drift left or right, and depending on the situation.
Yeah, because you have all sorts of situations that happen that you never saw coming. One of the things that strikes me in the book, and when you and I talked about a dark moment in your life, was the name of the book, when the Sea King that you were in, transiting from ship to ship, went down and you lost so many of your SAS colleagues, but you somehow survived. Do you want to just talk about the moment when that happened, and how many guys did you lose during that terrible tragedy?
Right. We've been told that we're going in the right direction, but we're on the wrong ship. So we had to go from HMS Hermes onto Fearless, because Intrepid, sorry, not Fearless. Reason being is they didn't want to take the aircraft carrier actually into St. Carlos water. They wanted to keep it outside. That was the reason we were doing a cross deck. Anyway, it was the last flight, apparently. I can remember sitting with about 30 other guys on the flight deck, and helicopter coming in, everyone piling on with their rucksacks and all this other stuff. The aircraft was actually chocker. And myself, Lawrence, and a guy called Sid Davison were the last three to get onto the aircraft. And I knew Dave Love, who was the sort of air crewman at the back, and I said, Dave, there's not enough room on here. We'll wait for the next one. He said, no, Splash, you're going to have to get on this one, because we're not doing any more flights tonight. So we piled on, and basically there was no seats in it, so we're all just sat on our rucksacks or on ammunition boxes and stuff like that inside the aircraft. And I was sat opposite the main cargo door at the back of the aircraft, which is on the port side, so on the starboard side. And between me and the door was the air crewman, Lawrence and Sid. And we flew over, and I can remember flying over the deck of Intrepid, and there was an aircraft still on that was actually turning, the rotors turning on the deck. And so our pilot, to give it time to lift off, took us off in a loop. And there was this, I can remember this being this very loud bang, if you like. And next thing I knew, we were underwater. And basically what happened, apparently an albatross or something had gone into the engine, catastrophic failure. And we went into the sea at about 80 miles an hour, and immediately underwater. And the worst thing was that the aircraft tilted onto its right side. And so that meant the door, my escape door, was actually facing downwards. So there was no way I was going to get out through that. I mean, you can imagine what it was like inside there. There's 30 guys, masses of kit being thrown around, and underwater, everyone's fighting to survive. I could feel people just stopping, moving around me. And I was just about to sort of take that breath, the one that would completely kill me, do me in. And suddenly my head popped out into an air pocket as the aircraft rose up on a wave. Okay, so the tail sort of popped out. And I just happened to be looking towards the tail of the aircraft. And what happens, the tail rotor had snapped off, and I could see a ship in the distance, silhouette of a ship in the distance. By now, there was no movement in there at all. The guys that were to my right, Lawrence and Sid, had gone, and Dave. So I knew that this hole, okay, I was underwater again. I knew this hole was a way out. So I went up through the tail, if you like, and got to the hole. And as I'm trying to climb out of it, I realized that I couldn't get through because I was too big. And what it was my fighting order, my belt order, was stopping me. So I ditched my belt order. And just as I was climbing out, I looked to my left, and I could see a few guys around one of these little life rafts about 30 meters away. So I jumped down into the water, swam across them, and joined up with the rest of the guys. And that was the escape from that helicopter.
Wow. I mean, just can't imagine what it's like. And again, this is where all that training you had and just the putting yourself through your paces on selection and everything else you've done throughout your career pays off. But you can never really get over a moment like that. I'm sure, do you find, I mean, member of your colleagues, I've had friends of mine who did P Company with me, talking about the PTSD they'd had. Do you find you get flashbacks to those moments and relive them, or have you managed to somehow come to terms with it?
I think I've come to terms with it myself. I do get a bit grit in the eye and stuff like that. But strangely enough, there were 9 of us that survived. The two pilots, and then 7 soldiers. 4 of them were badged SAS guys. Of those 9, there's only 1 who has actually got a diagnosis of PTSD, and he was one of the G Sqn signaler that was one of the other guys that survived.
Yeah,
but the rest of us, I honestly don't know why I don't get it. Maybe I'm just a hard-hearted twat. I think I've come to terms with it. Is what it is. But I still, it still upsets me sometimes.
Yeah, completely understandably, because you lost some really good people, and one of the people that you and I were talking about who really was a very fine leader was someone that when I joined the Green Howards, I heard about this man, and they spoke of him in with deep respect, and what a tragedy that he was killed in the Falklands as your troop commander. It turns out, small world. And I just want to go to the moment of when this happened, when Captain John Hamilton got his military cross, but he also lost his life. It was an operation, I understand, on West Falklands, observing the different settlements there just towards the end of the war, when there's quite a lot of troops there could do some real damage. And that you had a number of observation posts out, and his one was in a tricky situation where he and his, I think one of the operators was with him, and then 2 others were further away. But one of the Argentinian Special Forces patrols came upon it, and there was this firefight. Do you want to take it from that stage, Mark? What happened?
Yeah, I obviously wasn't actually involved with that incident, but having spoken to the signaler who was captured, basically what happened was that they split the OP into 2. So there was half the guys were actually observing, and half the guys were something like about 600 meters away in a hide. The guys in the hide saw a 12-man Argentinian patrol moving along the ridge, and they knew that they would come across the OP. They tried to tell them, but the radio, as they always do when you want them, the VHF radio, okay, which they were using voice on, failed, and they didn't get it. So it was heard on board ship in the ops room. They could hear it all happening. And basically what happened was that the Argentine patrol came up, spied the OP. A firefight started, and John told Roy to move, and they were doing the classic pepper potting out, what we call pepper potting, fire maneuver out.
Yeah.
John got hit in the back on his move and went down, and he told Roy, he said, I'm not going to be able to move. You carry on, I'll cover you out. And basically Roy then started to move back, and then Roy ran out of ammunition. Basically, he was having trouble changing his magazine, and the rounds were clipping all around him. And he then just shouted, "Stop!" put his hands up, and that he was captured. Unfortunately, John was dead by the time they got back to him, and that was it. But then Roy was taken off. John was buried with full military honours at Port Howard. Pardon me. And his grave is still there. Vicky, his wife, asked him to stay there. And probably one of the most beautiful places in the whole islands where he's been laid to rest. So.
Yeah, what a special man, and he was your troop commander. And Cedric was also your squadron commander. Have you caught up with Cedric over the years since then?
I kept bumping into him over the years. I mean, one of the classic ones was when I was a sergeant major at Warminster in my last sort of 4 years there, and he was general officer training or something like that. He was a lieutenant general anyway, and I can remember being warned that the general officer training was coming, and I just sort of blended into my office, got out of the way, and him and his entourage, about 20 of these senior officers, came wandering in, and he walked past my door and suddenly stopped, looked in, he said, "Splash!" Came in, closed the door, and all these senior officers, these colonels and whatever, are all stood out in the hall, and we sat there for about half an hour having a cup of coffee and a chin wag, and then he went out and then carried on with his visit, And then the next time I saw him after that was when he agreed to a meetup when we were formulating the book and the chat. And so the whole aim was that the book would be, my book would be would merge with his, if you know what I mean. That there would be no differences in it.
Yeah.
That was it.
And I've also really enjoyed reading his book, Across an Angry Sea, by Lieutenant General Sir Cedric Delves. And the two do come together really well. He was thinking strategically what was going on, but as you say, he went forward to that mountain. What was it called again? Kent, waiting for 4-2 Commando. And yours is a lovely view of both the excitement, but also the tedium and the fuck around factor, as they talk about it, and moving from ship to ship, but just taking it in your stride. And as Jose Sanchez said to me, he said, "You're definitely going to have Splash Ashton, because anybody who can talk about such a tragedy as the Sea King going down, everybody dying in there in Arctic waters," and he just says it was a bit chilly. That's the kind of understatement that you want. That's the kind of British reserve that we have. But look, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. It's very hard for people like myself and others who haven't been in that situation to relate. But I think it would be perhaps nice just to leave us with a top leadership tip, a practical tip, for you all your way up from private soldier to regimental sergeant major and having fought with the SAS in the Falklands War. Could you just basically introduce yourself, say who you are and the book you wrote, and then leave us with your 2-minute top leadership tip, Mark? So over to you for the final bit of the show.
Just a sec. I've got it written down.
That's okay. That's okay.
Right. Okay. For those that don't know, I joined the army in '64 as a boy, with no formal qualifications at all. I entered man service, they called it then, in 1966, and went to the Gloucestershire Regiment. And I served in Berlin, Minden, Belize, Canada, and Northern Ireland. I was a corporal at age 20, which is quite quick, in charge of 10 guys on operations in Northern Ireland in the early 70s when this was the shooting war. Okay, so there was never an officer around when you needed one. Everything was down to us. We did it, the junior NCOs. Within 5 years, I was a platoon sergeant, and then finally a platoon commander. And then I realized that my days were gone as a operational soldier. I'd be farmed out to training jobs and stuff like that. So I thought, nah, I'm too young. I'm 28 years old. I'm still got things that I need to do. So I did selection in 1978 and passed it. And then I've once again served all over the world doing different things, which I tell you about, but I'd have to kill you. And then went on to my big highlight of my whole service, really, which was the Falklands War. And I took part in, I'd say, taking of South Georgia, the raid on Pebble Island, and taking of Mount Kent. I was later, after I finished with the army, I went on to training jobs, really. I was the chief instructor at the International Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol School in Bavaria. Then I went back to UK and started up the infantry light roll course. Was doing that for about 5 years and brought it to the to one of the main promotion courses that's recognized in the army. And then I went off to train parachutists at Bryce Norton as the RSM parachute. And my ruling was that I would do the first descent on every course.
Wow.
So if the old gray-haired bugger can do it, then I can do it. That was my mantra on it. And then after that, I was posted to Warminster as the Divisional Sergeant Major for the Company Commanders Courses, where I learned how to chase cats, basically. Senior officers a pain in the arse. And then I actually retired from uniform service there. Now I went off to just across the square, basically, into another office as a civilian, civil servant, working for the Infantry Trials and Development Unit, producing urgent operational requirements for the guys working in Afghanistan and Iraq and that sort of thing.
Cool. And
since I retired in 2013, I'm basically a professional dog walker. for my border terrier, who is now across my feet actually at the moment and farting.
Sounds like my dog.
And basically my days are spent completely retired. I spend training for ultras, doing ultras. I cycle, I do Pilates, all that sort of stuff. I'm basically staying alive, hopefully. Okay. And finally, I've co-written a book with Colonel Stuart Tootle about my experiences during the Falklands War, called SAS Selection, and I recommend it. You can buy it on Amazon. No problem.
Well, that's brilliant, Mark. And what would be your top, as a practical soldier, what would be your top leadership tip for anybody listening? A bit of sound wisdom that served you well.
Okay, the first thing is you need to know the guys that you're working with. You've got to be approachable. They need to know that they can come to you if they've got problems or whatever. Always set an example. Okay, so be a good guy, and lead from the front. And the main thing is that loyalty goes down as well as up. If the guys know that you've got their back, they'll definitely look after yours. There you go.
Fantastic. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Mark Splash Ashton, the author of SAS Seeking Down, a definite good read. And thank you for sharing your stories, and thank you for your service to our country to free the Falklands Islands and to be there for your colleagues. It was a real pleasure and an honor having you on the show.
Namaste.